Welcome to Road to Cast, episode 6. Today is going to be an interesting and exciting conversation with what I think is one of the bright lights coming out of the U.S., even in this very dark time, someone who's thinking deeply about what it means to be a liberal in the 21st century and what it means for the future of the American left in general and the Democratic Party. Questions that I know I constantly am having, and I know everyone around the world is wondering about constantly now. So I bring you, without further ado, Dr. Samantha Hancox Lee, the associate editor from Liberal Currents magazine, and also one of the hosts of their fantabulous podcast, NeonLiberalism, which I think is a fantastically chewy and, just a perfect name to make for a podcast about liberalism. All right.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, no problem. And I think it's a very weird day because, unfortunately, even the last 12 hours between us setting this up and now have had, more earth-shattering world events. So there's no time to stop. And, in Europe, where I'm based out, it's the European Council's going on. We have all the world leaders deciding how they're going to respond to Trump and this new world. So my first question to you is, I think, what do you think's going on in everything? Like, how do you see this? Because there's panic from abroad.
I don't think panic is helpful, but I do think we are living through some serious times, some serious changes. It's kind of trite to say it, but elections have consequences, and we are now experiencing the truth of that in really, really awful fashion. And you can see Trump and the various brainies and madmen who are surrounding him have come into office intending to create a pretty strong rupture with what's been American policy since before the end of the Second World War. And so fundamentally, I think the world as we knew it is never coming back. The question is what we're going to do about that.
Yeah, I think this is a conversation I keep having with all of my friends who are calling me up trying to figure out what's going on, because they know I'm the person who was hyper focused on all this Russian Federation stuff. And I keep kind of saying this exact same thing to them. I'm like, for many, many decades, people on the left have been wanting there to be some sort of end to American empire, end to this current capitalist system, end to this thing that we've been doing in this neoliberal 30 years. It happened. It came to us. We didn't get to do it, unfortunately, but it is here. And that means the time for ideas. It is in itself a revolutionary time, even if we're not leading it, which I think is so vital that people get past that shock, that immediate shock, and realize there will be another side, as we saw in the last fascist period. And I think that's it's very important to reach that point faster than not.
I think that's right. I think political creativity begets political creativity, and that now is the time to start thinking about what we want to create on the other side of this. You don't want to get to power and then be at a loss of what to do. And because if you do that, someone will hand you a playbook and say, I've got this, it's ready to go. And you'll need to do something. And so you'll pick up the playbook and run with it. And that's why you kind of have to start answering these questions right now about what kind of a world do we want to rebuild when this is all over? I think it's also important to kind of understand what the world we had was. You called it the American Empire, and it goes by a lot of different names, right? People will say the American Empire or Pax Americana or the rules-based international order. That one's really popular in foreign policy circles these days. It wasn't always popular. There's a phrase you used when corresponding with me before this about the Atlantic Project or the Atlantic Order. And I like that one because that one has the best basis in history, actually, right? To understand where we're coming from, there's a specific moment before America even joins World War II. There's a meeting between Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and they signed something called the Atlantic Charter. And the Atlantic Charter, it's actually pretty short. It's a single page, and it's not a dense page either. You should just go look it up and read it. And the Atlantic Charter expresses the war aims of the United States and Britain. And rule number 1 with a bullet, the first principle of the Atlantic Charter is the Allies seek no aggrandizement, territorial or other. So that's the first. No conquest, no conquering your neighbors. They repeat that one a bunch of times. The freedom of people to determine their own form of government and free trade. free trade comes up a number of times in the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter is just it's a fascinating document, it's a fascinating historical episode, because there's no enforcement clause, right? There's no organization, there's no penalties. It is just a statement of principles. But it is a statement of principles that basically define the world for the next 50 to 70 years. Later kind of gets codified in certain ways in the North Atlantic Treaty, better known as NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is this mutual defense among the democracies, broadly speaking, that again says we're not going to conquer each other, and various other organizations are set up to say we're going to have free trade with each other. And these kinds of guiding principles of mutual defense, opposition to conquest, free trade are going to define the order of the world from World War II basically until now. And we're seeing that all starting to crumble.
Yeah, the document I tend to think about is the first Secretary General of NATO wrote a book called The First 5 Years. And it's a very interesting and also piece of its time. Like, it feels like a relic of this moment into a much more optimistic future where everything was new, possibilities felt endless. And even though they were building this thing in the response to, the Berlin airlift and a bunch of other stuff that had kicked off, they still felt fundamentally that at the end of the day, this project will work out to be a peace project. This project will help instill strong democracies that don't fall and to recoup the failures of the interwar period. I was even asked today by someone, they were asking me like, okay, how do you kick a country out of NATO? And I was like, okay, well, they did not design in the original treaty a mechanism to do this because the intention was that this would never happen because they didn't think that possibility was possible. And I was just like, and then I had to give them a very long explanation. I was like, yeah, they just didn't believe that it could happen. They just didn't believe it. And like, it's sad at the same time because like, you have to have such levels of optimism to design an organization that like, no one's ever going to leave, right? Like, so like, we don't need to design that mechanism or kick people out rather in a punishing way, because there is a leave mechanism, but there's no punishment mechanism.
I think that's interesting because in many ways they were right. The order that they built was much more durable than previous alliance systems, right? Like famously in the run up to World War I, Italy is in a formal alliance with Germany and Austria, and Italy looks at the war situation and says, we're just not going to be part of this. In fact, we're going to turn around and we are going to take a bite out of Austria, right? So there was an alliance there, but it was just based on like self-interest and national self-interest. And the minute the wind starts blowing in the other direction, Italy jumps ship. And this happens with alliance systems just constantly, right? Because they're just based on the balance of power. And the Atlantic Order was based on shared values. And those proved to be much more durable and much more reliable. You can see that even today, right? That France and Germany spent 100 years fighting each other, more than 100 really. The whole of Europe is like a cauldron of war for centuries. And the Atlantic Order puts a stop to that, right? That the countries of Europe no longer act like they have any security concerns with regard to each other whatsoever. And that's an amazing achievement. But like you say, if democratic backsliding happens, it's a serious problem. And it's an especially serious problem if it happens in the largest member of your alliance, the United States. To talk a little bit more about historical context here, during the Cold War, I think you could see NATO as a more balanced alliance system, that many countries in Europe maintained pretty substantial armies, self-standing armies, that gave them more of a say in the shape of the alliance and the nature of alliance policy and so forth. And we've all been living in the long, peaceful shadow of 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the peace dividend that led a lot of nations of Europe to functionally disarm, to say, we don't just have no security concerns with each other, we have no security concerns. And in many ways export the security burden of whatever to the United States. Right? And you kind of see this in I guess they would call this in fiction foreshadowing, in the intervention in Libya more than a decade ago now during the Arab Spring, where European militaries, the French especially, kind of take the lead in actually doing intervention, but most of the logistics, most of the ammunition, most of the support comes from the United States because these militaries don't have the capacity to intervene in Libya on their right? They have some tanks and they have some planes and they have some jets, but they don't have the stuff you need to like deliver that force to other people, right? And that's, as we're seeing now, that's a really serious problem now that we're living in Trump.
That's been a lot of the conversation the last few days in Europe, is that even the equipment that the Europeans own is American equipment that requires American approvals, especially like things like the F-35s. So you're just seeing like these layers of where cooperation, if that cooperation breaks down, becomes a very dangerous dependency, and then also something that can be effectively blackmail. It's become a very, very dangerous conversation. One of the other things I think about is how a force like NATO was able to also bind together military cultures between various military staff. In that book as well, he reflects upon this time going into one of like the early kind of like shape headquarters officer mixer things. And he would just go to lunch one day and he would just see like all these military officers from all over Europe. And you got to think about this is like 1949, 1950. Some of these dudes have fought against each other like in the last World War. And they were just all chatting together, talking, figuring out, like, they would all start learning the military French and military English, and they'd start talking together and sharing all these things. And you see, like, this was never done before. Like, it never existed. This kind of structure was completely new. And now it's a lot more normal to have that level of military, like, communications and cooperations, even outside of, like, formal heavy-duty alliance systems. But these were really groundbreaking things. This idea of, like, how do we tie up all of our relationships so much that like it would seem so nonsensical to ever pull them apart, and everyone just knows everybody, so it would seem crazy. And you can kind of see that right now. I think this also is why it's so important for Trump not just to put in loyalists because of they're loyal to Trump, but it's because they don't have any institutional ties to any of these systems. Like, they don't know anyone on the other side for them to feel bad about screwing over. And I think that is like one of the big major parts that maybe is missed in just like he wants people who will follow his orders. It's like he also wants people who won't feel bad about doing the things because they've had built up relationships with, Germans or French people or whatever. Yeah.
No, I think that's right. I think that's one of the things that Trump is going to struggle with. The American military is extremely large, and what you're talking about is not just replacing Secretary of Defense or a couple of aides at the top, but a wholesale transformation of culture, right? The entire office, or as it currently exists, was brought up in this way. So, but he's obviously going to try. We'll see how far he gets. But I think there's a lot to dwell on in what you said already about the kind of integration that NATO facilitated, and also the kinds of integration that maybe it hasn't yet created. I guess my framing here, for me, the thing that just is kind of overriding at this point is, look, I'm an American, but I have to admit, if you're a European, you have to recognize that America is not a reliable. If a Democrat is in power, they believe in the Atlantic project. If Trump is in power, he does not believe in the Atlantic project. So therefore, America is not a reliable partner. And decisions about the shape of European security are no longer being made in Washington. They are going to be made in Brussels. They are going to be made in European capitals. And so that kind of leaves you with this question: what kind of military strategy does Europe need? For me, I mean, you look at the state of the world right now, and the overriding security concern for Europe is we have to be able to fight and win a land war against Russia, right? Worst case scenario, Russia wins in Ukraine. They conquer Ukraine, or they make it a puppet state, or they take a big chunk out of it, and then they spend the next 4 or 5 years rebuilding their stockpiles. They keep the war economy going because they like the shape of the war economy. They're kind of used to it by now. They keep on cranking out tanks and planes and bombs and drones. In 4 or 5 years, they come back and they try to take a bite out of Poland. And that's when you have to be ready, right? You have to be ready. And what is required to be ready for that situation? You've talked a bit so far about how NATO fostered immense amount of kind of cultural, doctrinal, intelligence interchange between various NATO countries. But there's also still a lot of fragmentation in European militaries. And this applies on several levels. There's the procurement problem, right? Every single country wants to have their own tank, and they want to have their own self-propelled gun, and they want to have their own rifle, and they want to have their own this and that and the other thing, right? So you get these situations where, like, oh yeah, France makes this great self-propelled gun, the Caesar, and they make like 6 of them every year. And also Germany, when Germany makes a great self-propelled gun and they make, 20. And, it is spread across Europe. You're making a fair number of self-propelled guns, but every country has its own tiny little program and you don't have economies of scale, right? And if you're trying to fight a war, you need economies of scale, you need interchangeability of parts, you need commonality of supply chains. So that's a very serious problem.
Thing there is when you don't have the state as the main procurer for those industries, their clients are mainly international then. And then it creates like a bunch of weird situations because no longer are you thinking, I need to have production capacity for the state that I'm currently in. It's just like, I need production capacity for whatever bits and pieces people around the world are buying. And that's a very different mindset in a company.
No, I think that gets as well to the role of, money in all of this, right? That one of the reasons that every country wants to have its own little program is so that it can support their own little national industry. And there's matters of national pride as well. But again, if your overriding concern is we need to fight a land war against Russia, you need a level of fiscal consolidation, right? To say we are going to have a joint European procurement program that is going to be funded by joint European funding that may involve deficit spending, which has historically been pretty toxic in Germany and some other places, right? And it functionally is going to look like giving up a little bit of national sovereignty in exchange for a more functional overall military. But those are going to be some very tough conversations, right? Because change is hard. Some people think they're going to lose out on change. They're scared of change. But again, you don't want to have that conversation after the T-72s start rolling across the Polish border. You want to have it.
Yeah, 100%. And I also think, I've been trying to desperately find silver linings in this whole thing. I guess like the day after Vance's speech in Munich, I had the take and I was like, this means austerity is dead in Europe. Like it is dead. There's no universe you can build up the military and rebuild all the infrastructure and just the money you need to rebuild the train lines to move the shit from east to west is like, these are like huge numbers. And I think it's always like important to remember while America decided to do a lot of stimulus after the financial crisis and also again with Biden, Europe did not choose that direction. It chose austerity and that's what it's dealing with. And this is also why these numbers now are like wildly big. And even though they're very big, they're going to have to get way bigger too, because you're gonna have to backdate 20 years of stuff you didn't do, and the only way you do that is tons of money or way tons of labor, and those are the same thing effectively.
No, I think that's exactly right. Like I talked about earlier, it's not just having a new tank or consolidating on a single tank type or anything like that, but it's all the enablers, right? It is whether we're talking about stuff like transport and logistics or transport aircraft or tanker aircraft or AWACS or just munitions stockpiles. That's all been, what do they call that? Like infrastructure debt. There's an enormous infrastructure debt in European militaries, and that's going to need to get paid for. And I think you're right that has to mean the end of austerity, which is a good thing because austerity was terrible. It was an enormous self-inflicted wound on the entire continent. So it would be good if you all could stop doing that.
Yeah, I like that's my big takeaway is like Keynesianism is back. That is like what we do now. And if you say otherwise, you're going to sound like a crazy person now. Like actually, there was this very beautiful moment on Canadian television yesterday on the news, and they're doing like back-to-backs, all the political leaders responding to the tariffs, and they get to Pierre Proulx, and he's going out there being like, we are seeing an excuse by the Liberals to spend unlimited government money. It's like, how dare they use a crisis to try to just spend money? And then, this gets better, they mute him, move him to the top of the screen, and then go to an entirely separate politician and listen to their speech. And I was sitting there and I'm like, this is amazing. This is a magical moment. Because it's like that thing, you just sound insane now.
I mean, we've seen the Conservatives were on track to win a pretty substantial majority in Canada, and their numbers have literally you look at the graph and they've fallen off a cliff. Because the thing, like, sometimes a crisis is really a crisis and it has changed the shape of the world and you need to react and you need to react now. And I think Canada is in that situation, which is a level of insanity I can't imagine. The United States, I mean, sorry, I've been approaching these things in kind of an intellectual way. Sometimes the emotions get to me that, like,
it's that time.
This is the thing. This is a betrayal of people who have been our friends and our allies through all the great struggles of the 20th century. And we're throwing that away for what? For ego, machismo for bullshit. And I can't stand it. Sorry, just to put my intellectual hat back on now. When it comes to the European question, I've talked a little bit about procurement. I've talked a little bit about the fiscal issue. There's also organizational issues, right? That it's not just that you have your own tank, but everyone has their own armored brigade that has a similar culture and a similar doctrine, but is not in a unified command structure necessarily, and is not in a unified force structure where, the question is, what does Europe as a whole need to defend itself? What kinds of divisions, what kind of an air force? And then to make those decisions on a European level and say, okay, Belgium, you're not going to have armored brigades, but you're going to have some great mechanized brigades. And they're going to operate in a joint force structure that is like, again, you kind of have to know it in advance, right? You cannot settle what your joint force structure is after the bullets start flying. You want to settle it before. I think what's interesting here is you're not really getting away from interdependence. There's no going back to a world of just total national sovereignty and autarky, especially for nations of Europe, which are much, much smaller than like the Baltics, for example. No Baltic state is ever going to be in a position to stand off Russia by itself, right? They are always going to rely on the larger Europe Union. And I think that just has to be part of it, but there are ways to compromise with national sovereignty, again, to have like uniform national brigades or national divisions, theoretically, right? But to have a certain kind of accepted joint force structure that those divisions or brigades can be a part of.
One other thing that I honestly wasn't thinking about too much until yesterday was, so I had an Austrian colleague of mine, and they were talking about the rearmament. And this is incredibly controversial in Austria because it's officially constitutionally neutral. So this is like a big deal. He was saying like one of the main problems and concerns they have is that the Austrian military particularly is a vehicle of the Austrian right. Like it was established out of a very specific time. It was created by ex-Wehrmacht officers. It has a specific kind of culture in it that is not like the British or the French or the American militaries. It has like an authoritarian line on it. And he was saying like, I'm very worried because several of the militaries were set up in this like immediate post-World War II thing with Axis forces. That's just like the reality of it. And when you design your military culture out of those guys, you end up with some funky things. And his big fear was because they are seats of this, it's like, or will we end up creating a bigger monster when we fuel that in Austria? Because these are the same people that want to ally with Trump. It just goes back to like supporters of the FPÖ, supporters of Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. And it's like, that is something I'm afraid of. And I was saying like, yeah, I think this is a serious thing. I also think this is why the European army concept is perhaps a better idea, because you can create that baseline culture from scratch. I even mused a little bit, and you can maybe respond to this. Maybe one of the reasons the French and American militaries in particular are a bit different is because their particular incarnations predate their current state that they're in. Like the American military comes out of the revolution. The French military comes out of Free France in World War II. The state didn't exist when they were fighting for it. And so like that must be, really on like an institutional level, it must really change how you view your relationship to political leaders and power, because you are not, you existed for the idea of the republic, the idea of the state, not like the actual thing that existed at that time, which you were literally fighting against at some point.
I think this is very much a matter of culture. Back during Donald Trump's first term, there was some speculation that he was going to turn the military on protesters, on the George Floyd protests, on COVID-related protests. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, issues this memo. Again, it's very short. You should probably go read it. And there's something it just basically says, we, the Joint Force, all ranks, all services, we believe in America and we will uphold the Constitution. And he writes something in it's kind of boilerplate, but it basically says we're not going to shoot protesters. And if he personally pens something in on the side, and it says, we committed our lives to the idea that is America. We will stay true to that oath and the American people, right? Not to the president. It's not an oath to the president, it's an oath to the Constitution, right? And that culture is reinforced constantly at every level in the American military. Like, what do you stand for? It's the Constitution. Stand for the idea that is America, an idea of freedom and equality. And thus far, that's held pretty well, right? The military, in a lot of right-wing coups, like you've been talking about, the military is a power base for the right wing. And that's not at all the situation we're seeing here. The military is like clearly regarded by the right as like a problem for them, as one of their enemies. Just fascinating. But again, that varies based on tradition, that varies based on the nation. So I recognize it can be a real problem. If you're Austrian, I don't have an answer to that question. Although, like you say, more integration with NATO, more of an explicit commitment to the European project, these things can change people's values. They can change institutions over time, but it will take time.
I think also a big thing, and this is what I pitched, was we as liberals and on the left, we need to be more, not, I don't even want to use the word accepting, but like we should promote people to get into national security in these roles. Like it's really, really, really important. And there's just not enough people. And also there's just like a weirdness around it. I've even seen in your writings, you know, like liberals feel weird about this. Leftist people feel weird about it. It feels weird. It's a very weird environment, but also it's important. Just like the person that is the specialized bureaucrat that deals with water purity. Very niche role. You might not want to do it. Someone has to do the role though. And for me, like if we want a world where we don't have to have a forever recursion, this stuff going on, it has to be one where people take these roles up and then put those values into the institutions. Because otherwise, and unfortunately, I burned myself through 2 Pete Hegseth books this week. There are people who have very real views of how the military should be wielded as a view of ideological function for the far right and for like religious warfare. And it is deeply troubling. And that's a real plan. Like a political ideology sees it as a vehicle to do that. We need to see it as another vehicle to defend democracy and like keep our stable societies.
No, I think that's exactly right. Right. I mean, I've been on the internet, as you may know, and like, you know, it still is very common to see things like, you know, the military got these ads, and the ads would be like, if you're a lesbian, it's great. We would love to have you join the army. We need more lesbians in the army. And like people would like mock this and say, oh, that's rainbow capitalism or rainbow imperialism or blah, blah, blah. And I think functionally, we are not in a world where we are going to abolish the military. That's just like, you look at the world, that is not coming anytime soon. And that is not a realistic project, given the state of things, given the existence of far-right imperialists like Russia, like China, like the United States. Okay, if we live in that world, well, what would you prefer? Do you want a right-wing military or do you want a liberal military? And there's no third option, right? There's no situation where we don't have one. And if it's not us, it's going to be them. So I think you're exactly right. We need to both have liberal, leftist. I'm a liberal, not a leftist, but, you know, take that for what it's worth. Military personnel who have those values. We want to articulate a foreign policy and a defense policy that is consistent with our values, rather than just completely ceding the field on defense policy to the right. I think now more than ever, we see the need for that kind of liberal thinking on security and on defense.
Yeah. I think it's vital. And it was, you know, for years I was like banging on about the need to do like a progressive defense conference, and everyone was like, you're being too hawkish, like blah, 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 blah. And I was like, no, it's going to be super, super important. Like, I'll tell you, I hate being Cassandra. It's the worst thing to have for these predictive powers. It's a rough world, like you were saying earlier. And it's hard not to think about it just getting significantly worse. Like that's the bad part, is it's like, I don't see a potential where it doesn't lead into an actual war. Like I don't see the off-ramp right now.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I talked a little bit about the long shadow of 1991, which, you know, famously encapsulated by this book by Francis Fukuyama, The Last Man, or The End of History and the Last Man. Widely misunderstood what he was actually saying, but this is what people call it, the end of history. This idea that all the great wars were over and everything was just going to gradually become liberal democracy. And in that perspective, you can see how people think, well, we don't need a security policy. The only thing you could possibly do with an army is something stupid like going to war in Iraq. So we should just not have armies because we don't need that anymore, because that age of humanity is over. And soon we'll all just be, you know, peaceful, happy Europeans. This is not actually what Fukuyama says. In fact, in the book, he talks about well, liberalism has won the war of ideas and there are no alternatives, but people will get bored. People will go lusting for the chance, the hierarchy, they will go lusting for the chance to prove that they're better than other people. And perhaps anyways, I don't really want to talk about Fukuyama too much.
Can I ask you maybe a question along these lines, though?
Oh, yeah, sure. Go ahead.
In retrospect, do you think liberalism actually won the ideological battle in that moment? Because I think about like these 90, like David Duke, all these people, like the rise of the right in the 90s, and you can kind of like make a track from like 96 all the way to Donald Trump, and it's just a very short skip. So I wonder if it was like maybe the top part of the culture was very much like the liberal dominance, the liberal triumphalism, but I don't know if it was actually there. I'm not settled on this myself.
No, I think this is a good question. I think I would want to say kind of a couple things on this subject. One of which is that the idea that liberalism won the war of ideas was often justification of our kind of complacency, and a kind of complacency that says, well, society as it exists right now, we did it, and all that's left is these tiny little tinkerings around the edges, a little bit of incrementalism here, a little bit of reform there. And I think if you take liberalism seriously, we're not yet in a liberal society, right? There are still serious changes to our societies and to the world that we need to make on the basis of a liberal principle. And so I think that's kind of a dream we were all living in. I think Fukuyama's later writings actually take this seriously about the endurance of conservatism and conservative styles of politics, both on an individual psychological level and on a level of political structure, right? On an individual level, on the way that people, even after all their material needs may be met, they like hierarchy, right? They have a certain kind of zero-sum thinking that says, if someone else is winning, I must be losing, so I better make sure they lose in order for me to stay winning, right? Oh no, there are immigrants. I got to keep them out to keep myself safe and prosperous. And that's not true, but it's a style of thinking that it's easy to fall into, right? And we also see the endurance of conservative styles of governance in terms of corruption, in terms of patrimonial or patronage relationships, which is very much what we're starting to see happen with Trump, with the level of arbitrary and personal decisions that are emanating from the Trump White House. And this style of governance isn't new. In fact, it's ancient, but it still endures as a possibility of human social organization because it fits well with that kind of lizard brain love of hierarchy. So have we beaten that? No, evidently not. So a long struggle ahead of us.
This is going to be a very petty question, and I'm very sorry.
Yeah.
For you, what is, and give me one moment. I'm going to change chairs because I realize I normally do this not in a wheelie chair, and I'm dying here.
Get your appropriate thinking chair for petty questions.
Okay, so my question is, for you, what is liberalism in the 21st century from like today? It doesn't have to be forever. Like, where do you think it is? Where does it need to go? And what makes it different from what was before?
So generally speaking, when I define liberalism in the very broad strokes, I would say, for me, liberalism is a belief in human freedom and human autonomy, the capacity of people to set and pursue ends in their own lives. How that shakes out in terms of social structures, I would say I believe in freedom, I believe in democracy, and I believe in prosperity. Or another way, I believe in human rights, I believe in democracy again, and I believe in capitalism, broadly speaking. And I think these three things, there's so much debate. There's so much to talk about in terms of how do we implement them, and I think that's kind of where we are. So, for example, I think we're seeing ways in which the old order is breaking down. And so for example, like to do a little bit of self-critique. I used to be a lot more blasé about inequality. I used to be not as worried about millionaires or billionaires these days as threats to a democratic polity. And so, for example, there's a style of argument that I find very tiresome where people say, oh, we could easily have Medicare for all if only we taxed billionaires. And if you took all the money from the entire, 0.1% of America, you would fund Medicare for all for like a year or two, and then you'd be out of money. And you would have to start taxing and spending from the broad mass of people. Because billionaires are extremely rich, but compared to the scale of a modern economy, it's not really enough money to fund these broad-based social programs. So I don't really like that argument, but I think we are very much seeing the ways that this kind of concentrated power is itself a threat to democracy, right? When you can buy yourself a presidency the way Elon Musk has, that is profoundly dangerous. I think there's also certain kinds of economic arguments that you can find in Michael Pettis in this book, Trade Wars Are Class Wars, that inequality is actually hampering economic growth because the more money you have, the less a fraction of it you spend, and you go looking for investments. But as inequality gets worse and worse, well, there aren't investments out there that will make a return because the mass of people doesn't have enough money to buy stuff from your investment. So you get these kinds of spirals of stagnation and inequality at the same time. And a growing economy is going to require less inequality than we currently have. So I think these are ways in which a heedless free marketism, a kind of a mindless free marketism that says, well, just let the market do whatever it wants, undermines capitalism itself, right? As we see these people, the explosive growth of inequality both undermines economic growth and it leads to this kind of political corruption to crony capitalism, or these billionaires turn around and start trying to strangle the free market and start trying to rig the game in their favor. For liberals like myself, I think this is a problem we haven't really grappled with. And I think we need to be much, much more aggressive in terms of things like wealth taxes in the 21st century.
Could I perhaps introduce the idea that, I agree with you. I think I dislike this argument around you can tax billionaires to fund things because I think this is misunderstands how a modern fiat economy works and also how a government actually spends. Don't need to go there. We can just skip that past that point. But more importantly, I think the argument around taxing billionaires and I think the argument that is often missed, especially by American leftists, is the reason you tax billionaires is because wealth equates to political power, and you tax them to remove wealth, thus political power. It's not to fund a program. Even in an OG classical Marxist idea, it's rich guy has X amount of money converts to political power. If you remove some money, you remove some political power. And we see this in a very extreme way with Elon Musk, crazy money, infinite political power. Or also in cases, situations like Citizens United, which allows you to equate literally wealth with speech. And I think that's the important political conception that people need to get. It's not about paying for stuff. That's not why we tax the rich people. It's about removing political power they have by having that wealth. And then that's really, really important because the power is their capacity to use that wealth to do things. It's not, and also I think this is the other half. It's not if they use it just for bad things. That's a bad misnomer too. It's not if they're a good billionaire, then it's okay. It's no, that the potential for them to use such vast amounts of money for personal political ends disrupts the democracy on such a fundamental level that we are no longer equal. We do not all have equal votes. There are some kings and then there's peasants and then we vote occasionally. And that I think is the real thing that people need to get behind.
That's right. There's some books in political science that I really like, North Wallace and Weingast's Violence and Social Orders. And one of the ways to look at what they're talking about there is that prior to the modern world, pre-modern societies, basically you just have one hierarchy. And a hierarchy of wealth is the hierarchy of political power, is the hierarchy of cultural power, and just everything is kind of tied into one hierarchy that pervades all of society. And one of the achievements of liberalism is to pull all that apart. right? So that you have political power operating in one domain, and you have economic power operating in another domain, and you have cultural or associational power operating in another domain. And they're all intertwined, but they're not the same. And it's important to understand how they feed back into each other. An unhealthy political system in which people just gain absolute unchecked power, they are able to turn into an unhealthy economic system, right? And we've basically seen this happen in Hungary, where Orban was able to gain control of the political system. He passes all these laws that basically entrench himself and his party in power. And what they've done with unaccountable political power is create unaccountable economic power and complete corruption and crony capitalism, where if you want to get ahead in Hungary, you better know somebody in the party. And so I think we can see the same dynamic kind of happening in reverse in the United States, with, like you said, with Elon Musk. And so, yeah, if we let any one of these dynamics kind of run away and allow for unchecked accumulation of power, it's eventually going to start eating away at the whole system.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't even say it's in reverse. It's very much exactly like Orban, unfortunately. I mean, I think even if you want to crank the timeline a little bit, Betsy DeVos, the charter school stuff, like this is like right out of the Orban playbook. It's politicizing education systems, privatizing chunks out of the state, giving it to your rich buddies to be like political entities. I would want to push back just a little bit. I don't want to get into like a liberalism argument. But maybe just like for your own kind of like kick.
Whatever you're going to get with me is going to be a liberalism argument.
No. But like I don't want to like have a debate about like the flaws of liberalism or whatever. But like I'm more saying this to be like just for you to kick around your head, like in your own political thoughts. I think maybe the tension you're feeling like in your head around this. And I honestly I think I held the same thing when I moved to Europe like 7 years ago. Even though I felt like I was enlightened with like knowing more than like other people around me, it didn't really kind of click until I was kind of wrapped up in other countries' political spheres, because I realized what stuff was like nationalist conceptions that I'd put on, like limiters on what was possible and not possible and what could be and couldn't be. And one of the things that I think I realized, it's like American style capitalism and these more like deregulated versions of it, like they innately fall into this. Like you can see this all over Eastern Europe. You can see this all over the place in the Balkans. It's like when you have a system that is allowed to be freer and freer and freer, it becomes just snaps into oligarchs at some point. Because at one point, the state's the regulator, and at some point, the oligarchs just regulate things themselves. And that's a problem. And the only way you maintain a market in a general sense, not a free market, is by having huge amounts of regulation. Like if we really think of like how much artifice had to be set up around the world to maintain the global market, it's a huge amount of stuff and a huge amount of government spending and a huge amount of government regulation, a huge amount of everything. So it's like the idea that there's even like a free market, I think is just, we have to give up that premise. Like it just doesn't exist. Even in America, it doesn't exist. Like it's ridiculous. Like there is a market that we want to make sure functions. And I think that might be where we want to initiate the conversation, not just for liberals, but also like for leftists. Because I think people are like, we can just get rid of the market. I'm like, no, dude, people need to buy bread. Like people want to go buy a paper and get cigarettes or whatever, So it's like you got to get past that conception of like, there has to be a market because consumption has to occur or else people will die and get really pissed off. But it's also like accepting like we have to do a lot of things to make that exist. Not this idea that there's a fantasy free market we're trying to move ever closer towards or something. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, I know exactly what you're talking about. On a philosophical level, you're right. That markets don't exist out there in the ether. They don't maintain themselves. A free market requires a certain degree of government intervention. That's a philosophical point that I think is true. I kind of don't like the suggestion that that regulation is just a big dial you turn up and down. Because for me, I mean, that's how I used to think, right? When I was young, I thought, well, if you're a liberal, you believe in regulation. And if you're a conservative, you believe in deregulation. And the more regulation you believe in, the more liberal you are. And the more deregulation you believe in, the more conservative you are. And I think that's goofy, right? I think we can recognize that there are regulations that are conservative in their intent, right? So to take up one of my own personal bugbears, in the United States, which is housing and housing policy, right? If I own a patch of land in the United States in a city, and I want to tear down that, and I own the house on it, my house, and I want to tear down the house, and I want to build an apartment building, that's illegal. And really, you almost, no exception. Functionally, there are a few cases where you can do it, but mostly you just can't, right? And that is a law, that is a regulation, but that is a regulation which is conservative in its intent, right? The intent is to create an artificial scarcity of housing by preventing people from building more housing. And the goal of that is to enrich existing landowners functionally. That is the point of it. And also segregation. That's the other point here. Right. So I think we can recognize that there are restrictions on markets, on free markets, that are not liberal, that are not leftist, but are absolutely conservative in their intent. And so it's not really a question of do we want more regulation or less regulation? It's what we want is a market that delivers prosperity that is broadly shared. We want a market that sustains people's abilities to, like I said, to set their own ends, to engage in production and consumption on their own terms. And sometimes that's going to mean we need fewer kinds of regulations. Sometimes that's going to mean we need more regulations.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's a single spectrum here.
No. And just to like clarify, I actually was not even trying to do it as a dial of more and less regulation. I meant actually like as in there is or there is not, because as in the U.S., they're not turning the regulation down. They're eliminating regulatory agencies at the top level. And so like that's what I mean. Like when it's like something can or it will not be. And then also we even see this in like, for example, the tech industry. How many boards do they have that self-govern their own activities? And it's just the big ones too that are on these boards. It's mind-boggling at some points where you're like, oh, cool, you run your own company and then also regulate yourself? This seems like a great idea.
No, I think we're seeing from Elon Musk an extremely radical agenda. Like you say, not really thinking about picking and choosing, but just like we're going to close this government department, we're going to close that government department, we're going to close this, we're going to close that. And we'll see. I mean, we'll see how far they get.
And I mean, that's the similar conversation for like the far right in Europe as well. So it's like they're not at like the more or less regulation. They're at the just destroy departments stuff. So like it's a burn the house down kind of thing. Because like I'm totally on your side on like some regulations are stupid. They make no sense. And like this is also why we have to be like, does a thing work or not work? Does it do the thing we want it to do? Not in an esoteric is like, is this just an ideal liberal like policy, or is like, is this innately a it's like, no, does it do the thing? Like, and that's so much of government is just like, does it do the thing and does it do it well? And people forget that a lot. I think it's really important. Right. People don't forget that part.
I'm a very detail-oriented, policy-oriented person, and I think that this is something that kind of mystifies a lot of leftists and liberals, frankly. Right? We can recognize it on the conservative side, where if they pass a law that says, the Protecting America's Families and Children's Act might not actually be protecting America's children. It might actually be some law that is like making it easier for like fathers to rape their children, right? Like that just might be what's actually inside of the law. But I think we also have to recognize that if we pass an act that says like protecting workers and tenants, it's not necessarily an act that actually protects workers and tenants, right? You can call the law whatever you want. You can have whatever principles you want, but does the implementation actually do what you want it to do? That is a different question. And I think is often a technical question, not a moral question.
Yeah. And I think this is also like, it's important to understand that there's a big difference between like politics, like the political theater, and governance, which is a very different thing. The Trump administration loves politics. They really hate governance. And that's a big problem right there. One of the, oh, darn it, I forgot the point I was going to make. It was a spicy one too. Yeah. So just going off your point about the housing thing, I've got a kind of hot take about this because I hear the similar conversation in the US and the UK about it's hyper focused on just the building approval regulatory side and like licensing. But these laws, I have noticed, just don't exist in a lot of countries that have heavier social housing production, because they can't exist because the city would need to deal with them all the time. So I feel like a lot of that's like deeply linked in. And then the UK and the US took a very similar approach to like jettisoning their social housing programs. So like I think that's another thing that maybe activists want to think around. Like you can tie, well, first of all, in general, you need to have social housing in addition to just like private housing construction. It just doesn't work otherwise. You don't build enough homes. But I think this is another aspect of it. It's like different programs, different social aspects can, two birds, one stone, or even like multiple birds, multiple stones kind of deal.
I think that's right. And that kind of loops some of this back to what we were talking about at the beginning with the future of the Atlantic Project, with the meaning of a European military. I think a lot of people are going to be inclined to approach these questions from a moral perspective. Like, how do I feel about militarism, right? How do I feel about bombs? And maybe that's important for you on a personal level. I don't think it's a useful way of discussing policy when the bear is at your doorstep, right? When the bear is at your doorstep, the question is the door strong enough to keep the bear out? And we can talk later about what color we want to paint the door and what we want to call it. But functionally, like the fundamental question for Europe these days is, what do we need on a functional level to deliver security? Because otherwise, someone is going to start taking bites out of it. And I think that kind of thinking is just going to be necessary in this we're living in.
100%. And I think that was a good way to bring us back. Did you have anything else you wanted to chit-chat about?
No. Just to close out, to plug our own little
Yes, of course.
If you listeners were interested in what I had to say today, or just a general liberal perspective, you should come on over and check out liberalcurrents.com, a home for mere liberalism. Try to have kind of a fractious, diverse discussion, one that is committed to these core liberal principles in the 21st century and really standing for something. So yeah, come check that out. Come check out my podcast, NeonLiberalism. And thank you so much for having me on the Rotocast.
No problem. And honestly, I can back that up 100%. Like, even if you're not a liberal or American, it is like, it's very refreshing to see, young people coming up with thoughts about how they want to see their country, even if it's in crisis. And I think it's a heartening thing. I'm very big on the need for more progressive media, both in liberalism and the left and the Greens. And it's vital in this moment of time that we also have a big voice. So thank you so much.